Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think everyone is coming in here. So welcome to the online conference, Reactionary Digital Politics, Ideologies, Rhetoric, and Aesthetics. For those of you who are seeing for the first time, this is the third day of our 5-day conference. It's good to see a lot of names who have been here for days 1 and 2, and names of people who will be joining us days 4 and 5 as well. And the topic for today is reactionary rhetorics and aesthetics. Just to give a bit of background, this conference is the closing event of a 3-year research project, which has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. And the title, which we always feel the need to apologize for because it's a bit grandiose, but it is descriptive, is Political Ideology, Rhetoric, and Aesthetics in the 21st Century, the Case of the Alt-Right. So we started developing this project, or thinking about it, conceptualizing it, really almost 7 years ago. And then it's sort of taken some time to come together. But the idea of motivating it, or a key idea motivating it, is that digital media are changing politics fundamentally, changing how political ideas and arguments are taking shape, how they spread. And this is changing how people engage in politics, how they engage in political ideas. And in particular, as the name of this event and as of the grant project suggests, we wanted to look at how digital media have changed and in many cases benefited right-wing political thinking and its form, its content, its circulation. But we also recognize this was a big problem that couldn't be answered by one disciplinary approach alone. So we wanted to bring together scholars of media and communication with specialists in history of political ideas and political thought, scholars of rhetoric and performance and aesthetics, experts in the history and politics of racism and misogyny, and also scholars and activists with a detailed grasp of how political movements organize both in digital media and in real life. So the goal of this conference is to bring together a range of people with those that expertise and that capacity, so that we can share ideas and expertise, build better approaches, build better understandings. And I think you'll agree that today's panel attests to that range of expertise and disciplinary approach. And we also, with this conference, want a format that encourages discussion both among the panelists and among the audience as well. And it worked well last night and on the first night of the conference. Last night, we were talking about mapping and charting online extremism and the far right. And one thing I think of note that came out of that discussion was how important anti-feminism is in organizing the far right's commitment to natural inequality. And that's something that sort of came together from the different approaches of our speakers last night. And we also got a sense of how diffuse and transnational the far right has become, or maybe as it always has been. So this evening, we're looking at the techniques of propaganda and persuasion employed by the far right, and at the forms and styles of digital media, ranging from memes to video games and everything in between. So I think it's going to be a really good discussion. I'll briefly introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll be speaking, and then we can get going. So our first speaker will be Alfie Bown. He is lecturer in digital media and digital media culture and technology at Royal Holloway, University of London. He's the author of several books, including Enjoying It, Candy Crush and Capitalism, PlayStation Dreamworld, and In the Event of Laughter, Psychoanalysis, Literature, and Comedy. He's also co-editor of Post Memes, Seizing the Memes of Production, which is a fantastic collection of essays that is also open access, which is great. He's also written for The Guardian, The Paris Review, The New Statesman, and various other public-facing outlets, as we like to say now in academia. Next up will be Leslie A. Hahner, who is professor of communication at Baylor University. Her most recent book, which she co-authored with Heather Suzanne Woods, is Make America Meme Again, the Rhetoric of the Alt-Right. And as the title suggests, it takes a rhetorical approach to memes and memetic persuasion, looking at how memes congeal publics in the apt phraseology they use in the book. Leslie has also published widely in such journals as Rhetoric and Public Affairs, Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, Quarterly Journal of Speech, and many others. Too many to mention, really. But one article I think is worth highlighting for today in particular is a recent article published in Critical Studies in Media Communication entitled Black Panther and the Alt-Right, Networks of Racial Ideology. So that might be one you want to look at. Then we will hear from Alex Newhouse, who is Deputy Director of the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Alex was a video game journalist during what he's called, in his podcast that I was listening to, the hell times of Gamergate, which led him to focus in a more scholarly capacity on right-wing extremism. He is co-host of the Terrorism Bad podcast, and with CTEC, which is a crucial resource for anyone interested in the subject. And with colleagues there, Alex has written reports on a range of things, including the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the Oath Keepers, QAnon, a report on how AI and natural language generators can be used by extremists. So an absolutely vital resource that Alex has produced for all of us to benefit from. And then our final speaker will be Marc Tuters. Marc is assistant professor in the Media Studies Department in the New Media and Culture Division at the University of Amsterdam. He works with the Open Intelligence Lab, which is by consensus called OILAB, if you want to abbreviate. Another crucial resource that has a lot of really useful, publicly accessible documents to read and learn from. And he also works with the Digital Methods Initiative at Amsterdam. He works on radical political subcultures online, which is a beat he once described to me and Rob Gallagher, who is also with the project with us, as the bottom of the internet. And he has published widely as well, but a few recent publications of note include a paper on memetic antagonism on 4chan at New Media and Society, a really important paper on the deep vernacular web and the distinction between mask and face culture that he co-authored with Daniel DeZeo for Cultural Politics. I should also say, I noticed the co-author of the New Media and Society paper, Sal Hagen, I believe I saw among the participants as well. And another article worth mentioning just for this audience is an article on Pizzagate for MC Journal. So I think it's an amazing panel. I hope you'll agree. The basic format is everyone will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have some exchanges between the panel. I'll be chairing the discussion, but you might also hear from Rob Gallagher, who is here with us, who is the Senior Research Associate on the project, and Alan Finlayson, who's the Principal Investigator on the project. And one other name who's in the audience with us today is Cassian Osborne-Carey, who's also been an important part of the project during its development and continues to be. So after that discussion, we'll open the chat for questions from everyone else. And we might ask some of you to unmute and engage with us in discussion if you're interested in doing that. So we're really keen to hear from all of you as well. So I'll end there and hand it over to Alfie, who will be speaking first.
All right. Thanks, Rob, and thanks to both Robs and for the invite to come and so on. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint or anything. I'm just going to talk, so I'm just going to rely on sort of emotive facial expressions to convey my points, and hopefully be interesting. I mean, I was fascinated by, I'm also going to start with talking about Gamergate, so interested in what Alex has to say, but and also really interested in that this project has been going on for 7 years, which I was actually gonna specifically talk about the last, I wanted to specifically talk about the last 7 years in these discussions, which I guess in academic terms we could call the ref cycle, but the maddest ref cycle in the history of politics, and in digital media as well. And so, I mean, I basically came to thinking about politics and the digital through video games as well. And like I'd always been a, I'm going to do this talk quite informally, I think, but I'd always been more of like a scholar of philosophy, psychoanalysis, and my interest in psychoanalysis and politics. And it was really Gamergate. I've also been a gamer since age 7. And it was really Gamergate which made me think for a long time, you know, games had this association of either being kind of harmless escapism or harmful escapism, and suddenly then this situation arose with Gamergate in 2014, which basically suddenly the whole world's attention was on the relationship between games and politics. So from that I became interested in meme, and of course around the same time, or let's say the 2 years after that, with the rise of the right and the alt-right, the phrase the alt-right, and communities around 4chan and 8chan, the early days of QAnon and meme, I guess, Pepe, and the sudden response from the liberal media, you know, New York Times, Guardian, everyone, suddenly sort of shift their attention to what they perceived as this alt-right threat, which had sort of coalesced and you know, gathered attention and essentially influenced an election, but definitely reshaped the kind of political discussion terms through the internet, through memes, and my interest, I guess, was in the connection between that and video games. I got very interested in things like salt mining, which is when massive multiplayer gamers go online, like groups from 4chan or 8chan or something like that, would enter a game space and basically try and make people cry, which produces the tears, which contain salt, which then gets mined and posted to an image board or something, and then you can accrue points and so on for your kind of actions in those things, and terms like grieving and things like that. So basically how the gaming in the world of gaming has its kind of prehistory, like pre-2014, of these kind of like structures of digital life, which would eventually like burst into the public imagination in around 2014, 15, 16 as this hugely politically important and far right threat. But I think that the 7 years down the line, things are in a very different situation now. And I think that, and I suppose the most controversial kind of conclusion, which I'll draw in this brief 10 minutes, is that I think the sort of liberal backlash against the alt-right has really missed the point and screwed over the left, insofar as attention shifted immediately onto this kind of enemy of the far right, the alt-right, the various terms are associated with that, the idea of digital culture as a kind of incubation bed for radical right-wing ideas, has in fact led to reactionary politics in the purest like 19th century sense of being reactionary, in the sense of a restoration of political order and neoliberal centrism, which of course we've seen politically as well through Biden, through the destruction of Corbyn, Sanders, and so on. So I think talking now in 2021 about the far right is quite well. I put it this way: our job has to be to critique the liberal response to it as well as the far right itself. So, you know, I'm obviously not saying that anti-fascism is not a good cause. It is, but it has to also be accompanied by, let's say, anti-capitalism or anti-liberalism. And I think that the mistake that has been made is actually we fell into a trap of paying all our attention to what seemed like this dangerous subversive threat on the extremist right, and lost the kind of possibility of critiquing capitalism and liberalism itself, which I think, you know, is, well, which I think is the fundamental problem and what led to the far right being able to make those gains in 2014, 15, 16. Anyway, that's the sort of argument I'm going to make, and I'm going to try and do it through three kind of fun stories that I think are fun stories that have happened to me since 2014, or that I've encountered in my research. So I've actually been working more on the question of desire and politics. So how desires are reorganized to suit particular political agendas. So I'm just going to, like, really quickly in the next sort of 7 minutes tell three quick stories about things that moments where I thought there was significant change in our political desires, I suppose, in the service of a new kind of corporate capitalism, which needs to be the #1 enemy in digital culture from the progressive perspective, in my opinion. So the first of these is quite old now. In 2017, I went to Hangzhou. This is the only old story, the others are newer. So people who have talked to me before probably heard this one. The other two, I promise, are fresh, hot off the head. Yeah, I went to Hangzhou, and Hangzhou's a city in East China. It's the home of Alibaba, you know, Jack Ma's massive corporation. And I gave a talk there about Tencent, the company that owned WeChat. And I was just saying WeChat are evil, you know, this is what I basically say. And then at the end of the talk, like, two people from Alibaba came up to me in these suits. And I thought, like, oh shit, I need a lawyer. Because, you know, I was thinking, you know, in fact, you know, I was mistaken, but as a Westerner in China, I was thinking, well, I'm going to get in trouble for saying these things or something. Anyway, these people said to me, they didn't say that at all. They said, you hate WeChat, right? And I was like, yeah. And then they were like, oh, well, you must love Alibaba. And I was like, no, that's not how this works. You know, I hate you both. You're evil. Evil corporations, you're the same. And they were like, no, they didn't mind. They were like, no, don't be silly, we're the good guys. And there's actually this fascinating sort of rivalry in Hangzhou, very proud of being the the home of Alibaba. And Alibaba, of course, you know, it came out that year actually that Jack Ma was part of the CCP, and that there was this strange connection between the Chinese state and these huge tech companies that were rolling out these digital programs. So there's all that going on. Anyway, they took me to Cloud Town, which is basically Silicon Valley style hub in East China, in this kind of forest. It's got beanbags and all that. You know, you can imagine it's like the HBO comedy show, Silicon Valley. I asked them to show me what they thought was the most. They got amazing stuff. Like they're building sort of, they got things like, because it's the home of the city, which is Alibaba's like smart city development thing. And they got things like traffic lights, which know how everyone is when they're crossing the road. So if you're old, or if you've lived a harsh life, you get longer to cross the road than if you've got a fresh young face, and things like that. But they showed me this car that they claimed was the most impressive thing that they were working on at Cloud Town in 2017, which is this Rover. It's the German car, I think, isn't it, Rover, the car manufacturer? And anyway, I said to them, what's the most impressive thing about it? It's a self-driving car. It's got a drone that follows it around. It's mad. Anyway, I said, what's the most impressive thing about this car? And I was expecting him to say it's really fast, it's really safe, it's the car that can't crash, or it's really cool, or something like that. And he said, the car knows when you're hungry and what you might like to eat before you know that you're hungry and what you like to eat. So at the time, I didn't think so much of it. I thought, why would anyone care about that? But later, over time, I started to think about this. Actually, this is the most important thing about the car. And basically how this works, it syncs with your smartphone. It reads everything that you do, your behavior patterns. It's really at the heart of this kind of predictive analytics and predictive technology that these companies roll out. And it basically, if you like sushi at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, it says at 3:45, why don't you come to this sushi place instead? I can even drive you there. And I said, why does that matter? And they said, well, we are taking people away from restaurants which take cash or WeChat Pay and redirecting them to Alipay taking restaurants. Sponsors of Euro 2020, so everyone's suddenly heard of Alipay. But so the point here is that desires are being modified by the digital platform, and predictive technologies are not so much about giving people what they want, working out what people want and then giving it to them. They're much more about what Facebook boardroom people call nudging, basically working out how to nudge people in particular directions to the service of different kinds of corporate patterns and so on like that. Okay, so that's story number one. At the end, it'll all make sense, I promise. And I'm going to do the others quicker. So the second story is sometime later, I've been working on dating apps and doing a book on the politics of dating and internet dating, and also sex robots, smart condoms. Don't even start get me down that. But I had some time on Grindr, which was good. The beginning, but Grindr is really important because of this kind of you've probably seen it, those of you in the US, that Donald Trump kind of, so basically Grindr is the only dating app that isn't part of the own, which is that huge kind of weird building in New York that's looking across the river to Manhattan that looks like something out of Logan's Run. And inside there, they're basically housing like Tinder, Hinge, Bumble, this all in there. And Grindr was the only independent one, but it got bought out by a Chinese gaming company who wanted to use the intimate data to develop dating simulators that would basically function like Grindr does. And this is incredible, because basically the idea is to replace an interaction with a human with an interaction with a robot, but based on people's experience of Grindr. And actually, there's a journalist, Evan Moffat, who's done amazing work on Grindr. And since 2009, I think we could say that Grindr was the start of gamification in a certain way, because one of the things that was very typical to Grindr, and obviously you can see that like dating apps today are all gamified, but Grindr, you can collect points, things like that. But also people would go to like sex parties on Grindr and never leave their phone. So they'd be constantly on the phone, even maybe, that sounds like maybe the saucy end of it, but also just going for a date in a restaurant, they would stay on their phone the whole time, because the experience of having the date or of having the sex even is kind of mediated through this piece of technology. And so they would stay on the app the whole time through. So Grindr is actually like the first example of gamification, and maybe pre-augmented reality. And it would be fun, I think, to claim that Grindr was the kind of father of Pokemon Go or something like that, because it's a application which kind of sets the tone. Anyway, whatever, I'm talking a lot of tangents. But anyway, Trump tried to get Grindr back from China. This is just, I mean, you can't write this stuff. It sounds like something from Futurama, but basically, and Trump forced the Chinese company to sell Grindr back to America in 2019 because the intimate data was people. So you got this kind of misogynist, homophobe president fighting against the Chinese government, who themselves don't support LGBTQ plus rights, over this gay dating app because they wanted the date. And anyway, they won. Trump won that battle, and Grindr gets kind of returned. So that's the second story. Now quickly do the third one, and then I'll try and make it all make sense. And the third one is another dating app, which is even worse if there is such a thing as that, as Grindr, because it's a heterosexual dating app that I spent some time on when I was in Hong Kong. And it's a Chinese app, and basically it works by the Zima credit score, which is Alibaba's ranking system for people's social credit. So I'm sure you saw in the New York Times and so on, when Beijing had this social credit system they were going to implement. Like, oh my God, what are they doing over there? It's dystopia in China. But actually, these are things that happen in New York all the time, and part of the British system as well. We have those kind of gamification and social reward systems all over the place. But in any case, this dating app works by your Zima credit score. So you get this, if you get a mortgage and pay your bills on time, and if you you can also have there's a category called behavior. So if you do use the city in the way that they want you to, Alibaba wants you to, and there's a city with contacts as well. So if you haven't got any subversive friends who have had their content blocked online, then you get points. And so basically the more conformist you are, let's put it in a nutshell, the more conformist you are, the hotter dates you get. So to access the algorithm works out what you want, right? It works out the perfect dates for you, but it only gives you them if your score's high enough. So you have to sort of perform in a certain way in your cultural, social life, economic life, to be able to access the sort of higher echelons of the hot dates that the app's got prepared for you. All right, so why am I doing this? Because I think these three examples are just three fun examples of a huge pattern, which shows that we were all putting our attention, and I guess I'm aware that this is a controversial, in some ways, argument to make at an event which is supposed to be about the far right. But as somebody on what I think of as far left, I think these examples show us that we were often paying all our attention toward the wrong enemy when it comes to digital culture today. And that although, of course, anti-fascism and anti-extremism and operating against the right are absolutely vital things to be doing, I don't think they work and can work unless they're accompanied by a kind of fundamental anti-capitalism and anti-platform capitalism and anti-digital capitalism, because all these three stories show it is just fun ways. I could have 100 stories like this and make the point in lots of different ways, but our fundamental social lives are being organized by reactionary forces, not in the sense of the far right being reactionary, but in the sense of neoliberal capitalist Silicon Valley style corporations being reactionary, and forcing us into new patterns of behavior, which I think are very dangerous. And so I would say that in 2014, at the time of Gamergate, there was a genuine need to fight against the digital alt-right. But today, I think the situation has rather changed. And I think we need to fight instead against this, in some ways, older enemy of neoliberal platform digital capitalism, and would be fascinated to hear what other people kind of think about the last 7 years and this kind of claim that I'm making. And I will shut up because I've probably spent 4 minutes too long, but thank you for listening.
Thanks. That's fantastic. We welcome controversy. I should say, I said at the beginning, we've been working on this for 7 years, but the grant project started in 2018. Alan and I, like other people, were thinking about it before that, and sort of by the time we got the grant and everything. But I think that's a good point that you make about this sort of, is the alt-right what we should be interested in anymore, and perhaps not. And perhaps what happened is,
or not on its own.
Not on its own. I mean, perhaps what happened, yeah, like, I mean, this thing you're saying about gamification is really interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to it, but the idea that maybe they were just really good at playing the game, right? And we're missing the game itself to kind of really reduce what you're saying.
Like with
pithy.
QAnon, or
Yeah. Okay, so fascinating stuff, and I'm sure this will all come together with what other of our other panelists have to say. But we'll move swiftly along to Leslie Hahner, who is our next speaker.
Hi there. So I'm going to share my screen. I do have a presentation. Hold on. All right, so hi, I am Dr. Leslie Hahner. Today, I want to talk with you a little bit about what I'm seeing in terms of aesthetics as it relates to the far right. Now, when I talk about the far right, I've moved away from using the term alt-right. That's simply just not used as frequently as a self-identification term. When I use the term far right, it's going to be ideologically broad for reasons that are going to become clear as we get later into the presentation. As was mentioned earlier, I am the co-author with Heather Suzanne Woods of Make America Meme Again. I've been working on memes and digital culture since 2011. And as digital culture changed to become a much more scary place, so did my research. And over time, that has meant that I've moved in different spaces. I live in Texas, where in the United States, if you're not familiar, Texas is one of the hotbeds of white supremacy. Also, my home state of Missouri is the other hotbed of white supremacy. So we'll talk about my personal stakes in this, which have to do with radicalized family members and friends. But for today, what I want to get into is some specific things that I've been seeing in terms of how do we recognize the aesthetics of fascism in particular, in the wake of imploding and exploding ideologies. I've been recently working in security spaces, talking with folks from either state level security, cybersecurity, or federal level US cybersecurity, as well as I've talked with a few international groups, but the US was enough for me to be terrified that they have no idea what they're doing, and that there are some specific problems in terms of recognizing who these quote bad guys are or who the bad folks are. And that I want to pay attention to that from the level of aesthetics in terms of how do we recognize terrorists when those extremists or terrorists look different or even look similar to the people who they are looking for in some instances. And then as a rhetorical critic, I want to speak to what happens when the aesthetics of these far right collectives or individuals or creators start proliferating throughout culture. Okay, so imploding and exploding ideologies. I think many of us who are in this room are likely aware that reactionary movements are built on directly conflicting and often oppositional ideological positions. So even when Heather and I use the phrase alt-right, we have an entire chapter of the book that discusses that the alt-right is not a thing unto itself. It is a moniker, it is a name given to a set of peoples that have conflicting and often oppositional ideologies, but are nevertheless collected in a group. That is more true today than it was when we wrote that in 2018, right? It was published in 2019. So what's happening then is that individual actors as well as large collective groups are having these ideologies that are vastly conflicting. And instead, what we're doing is relying on the proliferation of aesthetic forms or even labels to do the work of identifying who the so-called bad folks are. So let me explain what that means and why I'm making that argument. And I'm going to push at that argument in just a second. Okay. So I'm going to specifically talk about vaporwave and fashwave as an aesthetic and as a style in this particular instance. I'm going to use Ross Cole to talk about that vapor is used as an aesthetic largely because it is difficult to pin down, because it can be modified, because it can operate as ether, right, in the way that we think about these aesthetic connections. But I also want to point to Pinto, who, and this is continuing a long line of visual culture scholarship, that the tensions of a culture take up residence in those aesthetic forms that become cultural currency, right? So if you think about the tensions that are being manifest either between neoliberalism and the failures of the far left, or the awfulness of the far right, the tensions between individualism and collectivism, the tensions between what is truth and what is falsity, the tensions between the state and anti-state groups are taking up residence in these aesthetic forms. Okay, so the tension itself becomes the pull, not necessarily adherence to an ideology, but rather we are attracted to some aesthetic forms, and I'm going to argue Fash Wave and Vaporwave are likely two of those, because they manifest those social tensions that we are playing with. Recognizability, which is a term that I'm borrowing from the likes of Hegel and Butler and so on, is that we have to have a way of identifying collectivities and locations of ideologies. And so in lieu of any kind of stable ideology or set or ways being in terms of who are the people who are trying to destroy our common principles, or who are the people who are enacting the most virulent forms of white supremacy, who are the people who are enacting the most virulent forms of white supremacy and misogyny simultaneously, those are getting attached more to aesthetic principles and ways of feeling, because there is no overarching ideology that makes it identifiable in other means. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a second. Okay, so many of you are going to be familiar with Withstatica as a manual that was passed around largely to talk about the aesthetic creating something beautiful out of waste, right? And so you're going to see the vaporwave imagery being used in a fascist fashion. You're going to see the art of the right is how this is described. This is the avant-garde location of far-right art. And more importantly, that nihilism and existential pain is the basis of this art. I have a longer project on precarity as the basis of why this is the location for far-right art. But for this presentation, I just want you to pay attention to two things: the tension between traditionalism and progress manifest in these images, okay? The reason why I want you to point to that is because we're gonna go to a set of 2019 images. And the 2019 images are called Churchwave. I work at the world's largest Baptist university, though I am not a Baptist myself. What is happening in Churchwave is a specific attempt to steal the advocacy of Withstatica, Vaporwave, and Fash Wave and transform that imagery into specific propaganda for churches, largely based on traditionalism and largely based on something that many Protestants call complementarianism, which is the idea that man is the head of the household and everyone should submit to him. This has been heavily critiqued. This is a site of protest. So Churchwave is an attempt specifically to hearken to many of the principles that you see in Withstatica, but to dull them such that they become mainstream church propaganda. Okay, I do happen to be a Methodist, so I'm going to go after my own church. This is 2021 images from the Instagram page for the United Methodist Church. You can see that while they may not be familiar with Fash Wave or Vaporwave, they are nevertheless taking up Churchwave very clearly. Now, I want to be very plain here that I am not arguing that the United Methodist Church is into Fash Wave. However, aesthetically, the promiscuity of Fash Wave gives them the traction to make arguments about traditionalism, to give them arguments about anti-capitalism, and to give them arguments about late capitalist existence and existential pain that is useful for them, okay? So the reason I want to make this argument is that for churches and for others who are stealing Vaporwave and Fash Wave aesthetics, it is specifically to attract viewers towards fascist beliefs like Christian nationalism or fascist adjacent sort of gateway drugs like traditionalism. This is not to suggest that everyone who buys into traditionalism is going to become a fascist, obviously, but rather that the use of anti-corporate, anti-statist imagery is so ubiquitous now that it becomes a practical problem. It becomes a practical problem both for navigation of the internet for common users, but it also becomes a problem in terms of counter-terrorist work, both for researchers and for people who are involved in this at the federal or state level or agency level. So here's what that means. When I interact with people from the Department of Homeland Security, or when I interact with people from Cyber Florida, which is the most advanced institute in the United States to try and catch terrorists who are willing to commit crimes, they are, one, almost wholly unable to distinguish those aesthetic forms that are ironic or parodic from legitimate investments because of the proliferation of that aesthetic style. Two, they are unwilling to think about how images like memes and other gaming culture aspects can be brought into counterterrorism work. Instead, they are almost wholly focused on the words that are used from a textual level, which becomes increasingly difficult to monitor. And simultaneously, the ideological incoherence of these groups presents another practical problem, that they have trouble distinguishing left from right, and they would prefer to land on the opinion that, quote, all crimes matter. What that means is the specific points of leverage that are used to create mass shootings like the ones that have recently happened in Austin, Texas, or San Antonio are utterly invisible because of both the proliferation of that aesthetic and the lack of contextual knowledge to understand how these things are being used. So when I get to these final points, then I want to think about then, as a rhetorical critic, what does a rhetorical resonance offer beyond just aesthetic proliferation? It's not just style, but it becomes an affective structure that attracts both Christian nationalists and traditionalists, but becomes a practical problem for researchers and counterterrorism experts. With that, I'm going to stop for now, but those are some of the highlights I wanted to bring to the table.
Thank you, Leslie. That was fantastic. I mean, I think there's a lot of clear resonances with what Alfie was saying about desire, with what you're saying about how we're attracted to the tension and to the way that tension finds an aesthetic form. It is really interesting. It also, I think, resonates with some of the speakers from yesterday. Alexandra Ministern was talking about the erosion zone, and I think there's a way, maybe once we get to the Q&A, we can put that in conversation with what you're saying about this ideological incoherence. And there's a certain affective productiveness to that incoherence, which is really interesting to think about. So that's fantastic. Thank you. I should stop commenting so long afterward, or we won't have time for the Q&A. So let's move along. Just so it's such interesting talks. But let's move along to our next speaker, who is Alex Newhouse. Take it away, Alex.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Leslie and Alfie, for starting us off. I come at this from an extremism studies standpoint, so apologies to the rhetoricians, communications people, and linguists in the audience if I get anything wrong on the theory side. But I wanted to, actually, Leslie and Alfie's talks really dovetail nicely into what I'm going to be talking about, which is zooming into a very, very specific movement and trend within far-right reactionary aesthetics. I'm going to be talking about accelerationism. So if you're not familiar at this point with what accelerationism is, it's essentially a unifying doctrine aiming at total social collapse. That collapse can take a variety of different ways, or for a variety of different forms, and it can be achieved through a variety of different means. But essentially, that is what we are talking about when we talk about far-right accelerationism. So I'm going to switch over to some slides here. Let's go over to here. Can you still see it when I'm in presentation mode here? Sweet. So I wanted to start off with a description or a discussion of why I think that we need to focus on accelerationism at this current moment in time. In my view, accelerationism is one of the most concerning reactionary trends in recent years because it has driven an increasing unification across ideological lines and across movement lines in a way that we really haven't seen before. And this actually speaks a lot to the ideological incoherence that Leslie was talking about. While it crosses ideological lines, there is a unification under a motive, under a doctrine, under some sort of end goal, which is the collapse of civilization, the collapse of society, the collapse of government. We also know that there is a discrete network of accelerationist movements, groups, and individuals that crosses national lines as well as ideological lines. And I've actually done quite a bit of work on actually mapping out the neo-fascist accelerationist side of this. I wrote a piece on this that was published relatively recently that you can go find on that particular side of it. And then the final thing I wanted to mention as to what we know about accelerationism today, we know that it connects many mass shooters that would otherwise seem disparate, incoherent, or unconnected without the framework of accelerationism to explain it. So one of my favorite examples of this is that Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, was motivated by accelerationism. His manifesto is rife with the red flags that we know now are signals of adherence to this doctrine. So was Connor Betts, the Dayton, Ohio shooter, who at the time was covered in the media as being an anti-fascist sympathizer, as some sort of leftist mass shooter. But later research showed that he was ideologically aligned and immersed in occult and Nazi-influenced music scenes, actually. And those scenes we know now are heavily infiltrated by accelerationist activists and agitators. So the big question now for research is, similar to what Leslie ended up concluding with, is how do we actually detect and monitor the influence of accelerationism within a community and a movement? We know that it is becoming influential. We know it is inspiring mass shooters, but because it is cross-ideological and because it is transnational, it poses a particularly unique challenge for actually detecting and monitoring its influence. And so what I want to do throughout today and throughout this talk is to argue that we can actually potentially use aesthetic markers to begin to put together an idea of how to detect its influence across communities on the internet, and also sometimes in the real world as well. So basically what I want to come to is to start putting forward a way that we can understand these two images as as essentially like two different elements within a broader cohesive-ish umbrella doctrine slash philosophy. So if you're not familiar, the image on the left is from the room of the would-be Walmart shooter who was caught and arrested in the United States a few weeks ago. It has, if you see this picture in the wild and you don't know what's going on here, like there are a ton of seemingly incoherent symbols and icons that are present here, from the Saudi Arabian flag to the Sonnenrad, the Nazi symbol, to the Confederate battle flag, to a copy of the Quran, and a copy of the Turner Diaries, and a copy of Revolt Against the Modern World. So what I want to propose is that accelerationism gives us a way to understand this, and it also gives us a way to understand what comes up on the right here, which is an image in the pattern of the waves, the terror waves, the fash waves, the various other sorts of aesthetic waves that Leslie was talking about as well. These things are connected, and accelerationism is the fabric that connects them. So today, contemporary accelerationism, when I refer to that in the context of the far right, what I'm really referring to is insurrectionary accelerationism, which is essentially a set of tactics, and like I keep referring, a doctrine that ascribes the use of small cell targeted violence and infiltration to cause social chaos and destruction. So as I've been referencing, this is a pretty significant challenge for both law enforcement and researchers, because of the fact that the end goal is basically chaos and destruction. There isn't a cohesive idea of what comes next. There's not really a focus on building anything. The point is destruction. As a result, small cell violence is much more powerful in that paradigm, because all they need to do is cause fear, paranoia, conflict, and push on the divisions already latent within society, which means that a very small number of people can have an outsized influence for achieving accelerationist goals. There are a handful of different flavors of accelerationism that are active today. The most famous or most infamous one is what I refer to as the Skull Mask Network, which is the neo-fascist accelerationist network. The image on the right here from the Atomwaffen division is indicative of the Skull Mask Network, including an image of the skull mask, the eponymous skull mask there. The Boogaloo movement has been heavily influenced by accelerationist philosophy. there is an increasing trend in anarcho-primitivist communities actually adhering and subscribing to accelerationist rhetoric and goals. And then there may actually be some parts of the left, particularly within hardcore insurrectionary Maoist communities, that are also beginning to increasingly subscribe to like nihilistic goals or revolutionary goals, all the way up to full-blown accelerationism. So the most infamous aesthetic manifestation of accelerationism is from the neo-fascist side. And this has been talked about quite a bit, and it was the first coherent visual language of contemporary accelerationism. It was pioneered on a website called Iron March, which was a white supremacist forum active between 2011 and 2017. And the way that I described that forum is that it was essentially a town hall for fascists and accelerationists to come together, share ideas, organize, and produce, in this case, propaganda. The users of Iron March created a bunch of terrorist movements that would go out and actually cause violence, most infamously Aanenwaffen Division, but they were also involved in the creation of National Action in the UK, Sonnenkriegs Division in the UK, Skydos in Lithuania. There were members of the Nordic Resistance Movement in Iron March. There were members of Casa Pound from Italy, Golden Dawn from Greece. So it was very much a transnational town hall gathering place of these movements and groups. The reason why Iron March was important as well, though, is because it allowed for these groups, these small cell groups, to actually basically offload the work of marketing themselves. So they engaged with other users on Iron March who may not have necessarily been quote unquote Aanenwaffen members, and actually used them to create the propaganda that got their groups off the ground and into the public consciousness. So most of the propaganda that came out of Iron March was actually created by a very small number of people who were making it essentially for all of the various groups that were coming out of the website. One of the most one of the pieces of aesthetics that had the most longevity was what has been dubbed siege font, which is essentially this very spiky, like very in-your-face font that is used across neo-fascist accelerationist propaganda. So the unifying aspect of siegeism and siege culture was an adherence to siege, which was James Mason's, so neo-Nazi James Mason wrote a series of newsletters that was compiled into a book in the 1990s, which essentially pioneered the idea of insurrectionary small cell terrorism to achieve accelerationist goals, the collapse of society. So all of these images that you see here are in the vein of siege culture. They all have the siege font. They all, most of them promote the skull mask. They heavily reference sort of like occult esoteric Nazi iconography, like the Sonnenrad. The neo-fascists at this point aesthetically were very much involved in resurrecting these old sort of like more or rather lesser known, more esoteric Nazi iconography and symbols like the Sonnenrad and like others. And so Iron March was this sort of like this force multiplier for the creation of a unified aesthetic among neo-fascist accelerationists. And there was actually, we can pinpoint one person who was very much vital to the creation of this shared aesthetic, and it's a user by the name of Dark Foreigner. To this point, he still hasn't been identified, but he joined Iron March toward the, we think it's a man, but he joined Iron March toward the end of its run in mid-2017 and became a very prolific artist in the neo-fascist scene. He and his art defined much of what became siege culture. He's also importantly Canadian. So he was a link to Aanenwaffen Division and the various other sorts of neo-fascist groups spinning out of Iron March, and one of the first connections who was living in Canada at the time. Dark Foreigner, even after Iron March went down, would continue to produce propaganda. He helped get Sonnenkriegs Division and Feuerkrieg Division off the ground, and drove the continued life of the unified siege culture aesthetic and thus the network as well, far into the 2018, 2019, and even 2020. At this point, he's as far as we know, he's gone underground and it's been very quiet for about a little over a year, I believe. But the legacy of this unified aesthetic continues to live on. But another thing that happened was after Iron March, the Skull Mask networks moved to Telegram, where they ended up coming into contact with many more groups and movements of various fringe ideologies that were, far afield from the sort of core siegist, neo-fascist, accelerationist network that had been created on Iron March. And as a result, they started moving more to the adoption of these wave spinoffs, like Leslie was mentioning. So, the big ones are, of course, Fash Wave and Terror Wave, which is essentially like the used vaporwave aesthetics to glorify the use of violence and insurrectionary activity. But there were a variety of others. So like the one on the far left here is a version of like a far afield wave subgenre that was espousing eco-fascist ideologies. The one on the middle left here is just basically like a accelerationist, no fascist symbolism that's very apparent, but more just a celebration of violence in general. This middle right image is another sort of terror wave plus eco-fascist iconography image, and then of course you've got your sort of more classic vaporwave spinoff on the far right here, with the added variation of the sun and red rising behind the trees. So the hypothesis I'm putting forward here is that this aesthetic, this gradual shift to the waves coincided with the broadening of coalitional accelerationism to include far more types of extremism than had been present on Iron March. So these include like fringe, hardcore, violent Catholicism, anarcho-primitivism, eco-fascism, and even Christian identity. And one of my favorite examples of the Christian identity influence, which I don't have in this presentation, is a vaporwave image of Jesus standing holding a cross with the sun and red rising behind him. So again, like the connective tissue here is that adherence to the vaporwave aesthetic and its various spinoffs. But what I want to mention too is that siegism and its influence remained pertinent, remained important throughout this evolution as well. And you continue to see siege font and various, like the esoteric Nazi symbols showing up even as vaporwave spinoffs became the dominant aesthetic for accelerationists. And what this leads to is actually the Boogaloo movement. The first wave of the Boogaloo movement was driven by this group / community called Patriot Wave. Obviously, with the wave attached to it, it's very much like they were very much trying to, evoke the same sort of effect and emotions that had been driven by the rise of Fash Wave and Terror Wave over the past, the 2 or 3 years before it. The really interesting thing about this is that Patriot Wave was showing a bunch of the same trends that had been pioneered in Terror Wave and Fash Wave rather than in Vaporwave originally. So it was pulling things like the idolization of violent acts, the casting of mass shooters and other violent figures as heroes in the sort of like vaporwave spin-off images, which would be completely unparsable if you weren't already immersed in the Terror Wave and Fash Wave cultures. We know now that the Patriot Wave founder was already himself immersed in fascist, neo-fascist, and accelerationist communities, so it makes sense. But my point is that we can actually start seeing through lines based on these sort of markers of those variations that were evolving post Iron March in those neo-fascist spaces. So I'm going to leave it here because I know I've been going for a while now. But what I want to say, or what I want to finish with, is basically that that incoherent, the seeming ideological incoherence that Leslie was talking about is true and is apparent. But in my opinion, and the argument I want to put forward is that we can look to aesthetics to find touch points, to find connective tissue, and to find the evocation of the sort of like overarching motives and goals of the global accelerationist coalition movement, whatever you might want to say. So I'll end it there.
Thanks so much. That's great, and it's great to hear I mean, these talks are already coming into conversation with one another, and this theme of how an aesthetic form can combine something that might otherwise be, if not incoherent, then at least in tension, right? These different groups with kind of different histories, different lineages, different sort of doctrines and doctrinal approaches, but then they coalesce around a kind of aesthetic, which can be a kind of binding force. So that's, I mean, that's really fascinating, and something we'll come back to for sure in the Q&A. But let's move on to our next speaker, our final speaker, before we have a fuller conversation. Marc Tuters, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the great talks. So I'd like to myself talk a little bit about studying political subcultures online with my colleagues at the OILAB and some other colleagues as well. So what I would like to do today is to say a few things about method, show you some graphs about how memes develop and move from 4chan, which I know the most about in this case, into the mainstream, if we can call it that. And then at the end, I'd like to make a very brief argument about how memes aren't actually a good concept for media studies, which is the field that I'm in, drawing on the work of Tony Sampson. So I'll start by saying a few things about method. So first, I'd like to position this research as problematizing the assumed pro-sociality of what has been called the consensus theory of social media from the late 2000s. That was a term, consensus theory, by Daniel Kreis. So concepts that I would say are in this space, current concepts, would it be terms like reactionary fandom by Mel Stanfill, dark participation by Thorsten Quandt, and dark platforms by Jing Shen. The second concept I would like to bring up is the concept of methodological empathy from Roger Griffin, a leading figure in fascism studies. And the idea here is that understanding is essential to de-radicalization. This is not a field that I am in, but I do feel that this work is in dialogue with that field. So in this case, that would be understanding how political subcultures use infrastructure and vernaculars in creative ways, and then how this can tie into some of these phenomena that we've been hearing about today. The third point is, on method is specifically how the kinds of methods that we use, empirical methods that we use, which I would call quali-quanti, a term coined by Bruno Latour and Tommaso Venturini. And that's a combination of digital methods, computational linguistics, ethnography, and even a little bit of art on occasion. And this is used to study things like 4chan memes, conspiracy theories, if you want to call them that, fantasies like Pizzagate, QAnon, and so forth. Also with Tommaso Venturini, the idea is to consider these online communications temporally as opposed to topographically. So in time series, as opposed to these kind of topographic networks that have tended to be the way that a lot of this kind of research has proceeded. So then looking at how memes develop within particular platforms, and also then how they spread between platforms. The fourth point is, as a humanities scholar, the work also involves some sort of conceptual innovation. As I said, I feel memetics is inadequate. So this goes from sort of quite abstract ideas to relatively simple heuristics. And actually, at this point, I will share screen because, as I said, I have a few graphs. And I do know how to do this because we've all been in this environment for a great while now. Okay, so then, yes. All right, so we all know this fellow. But this is actually the sort of starting image that I want to begin with here. So this is like a heuristic for how to understand memes like QAnon, which of course, showed up in the center of the Capitol recently, the American Capitol, how they spread and the role of subcultures. And so there's a kind of a heuristic that I've developed with some colleagues, this idea that you can think of the web as having these layers along the lines of sort of subculture and mainstream. And the point that I would like to make here is along the lines of this this notion of methodological empathy, is that you can think of subcultures as engaged in critique, in some cases, critique of dominant systems of power. So we can think then along those lines, and this actually ties a little bit back, I think, in some ways to what Alfie was saying, that the dominant system of power online is what you could call data extractivism. That's the business model of platform capitalism. It's based on ubiquitous surveillance. And the anonymous subcultures that live at the bottom of the web are outside of that regime. So there is a way to think of some of their perspective in those terms. They kind of participate in this the way that we used to think in the old days about cyber theory, this kind of imaginary of the web as a site of identity play that's disconnected from the real world. And this is not in any way to justify anything that goes on there, but it might help understand some of these practices. So I want to now go on to say a few things about 4chan. So 4chan, as people know, is an anonymous and ephemeral site. It consists of a whole bunch of boards, about I think 74, that are structured as lists of threads. And each one is ranked according to the most recent post that it has received. So threads are immediately pushed down by new arrivals. This is a depiction of this that was made by Saul Hagen. They're pushed down by new arrivals, and unless they're constantly bumped up by new comments. So it's a very ephemeral and fast-moving place. And each board is limited to a few hundred of these threads, which means that even popular threads are soon closed for new postings. And because each board can only actually contain a maximum of 150 threads, then even when a thread is closed, it will eventually then only last for a while before it is actually deleted. So it's a very ephemeral place. So the question then is, why does stuff from this strange and chaotic place then travel? Why have so much stuff traveled from 4chan? I think we can think in terms of the theory of memetics, that this is a very harsh environment. And so things need to become resilient in this very harsh environment. That's how memetics would frame it, as a kind of an evolutionary theory. You can think also of practices that go on within these places that create meaning within a meaningless environment, as my colleague Tommaso Venturini has said in looking at this work. So what people then do to create this meaning in a meaningless environment, amongst other things, is they create these things called general threads in order to counteract the ephemerality, in order to hang on to the discussions that are going on. This is a representation of how threads continue a conversation over the course of time on 4chan. What these threads do is they summarize and repost conversations that were previously going on once they've reached a maximum number of comments. And what we found in our research is that in the course of this general thread structure, in the course of 25 hours of 19 of these general threads, this is how the Pizzagate theory conspiracy narrative was invented. And when I say invented, nothing new was actually really invented, but things were kind of connected in strange ways. And soon thereafter, that was one day, it acquired a meme status through alt-right influencers, and that led to a man self-investigating with a weapon. I discussed this Pizzagate thing with a communication scholar called Lance Bennett at the time, and it appeared to him that this was a kind of a new bottom-up kind of agenda setting, which is agenda setting in the field of communication studies has always been a top-down phenomenon. So we could think of this as following Lance Bennett as agenda setting from the fringe to the mainstream. I would like to now go on to show you, this then is a representation of the same phenomenon, but not with Pizzagate, but with QAnon, and not in the course of one day, but in the course of 1 month. And what this represents, this image, is a kind of a bibliometrics of the citations by within these general threads to the so-called drops that Q, the so-called Q figure, left within the within 4chan. And this is a very kind of interesting way of conceptualizing how it is that the sort of I guess the production of fake facts within this kind of factory environment. I'll now want to move on to, so already you see this is a representation of the month of November. So already by just sort of partway in there, by the 17th of November, actually, 3 influencers started to translate this from 4chan initially into YouTube, and then they set up a subreddit. And this is a representation of the kind of the traveling of QAnon across different platforms. You see on the very bottom, the QAnon conspiracy theory being discussed on 4chan, and then its kind of occurrence across different platforms. So we can, the idea then theoretically is that we can trace the dynamics of imitation. The idea of imitation here would be, I would be referencing theoretically Gabriel Tard as read through both Bruno Latour, but also for me, very importantly, Deleuze and Guattari. But we can also think of this in terms, theoretical terms discussed by subculture studies. So we can think of this in terms of the idea of the cultural products of subcultures that are incorporated into hegemony, as Dick Hebdige would say. But I think here we need to be careful and sort of problematize the jargon of authenticity of subculture studies, as Sarah Thornton has done so well. So I'll just give you like another image here. These are Pepe the Frog images from 4chan. 4chan's, you see mixed in among, this is one day of Pepe the Frogs around the time of the US election on 4chan poll. And you see a bunch of ironic Nazism in here. And this ironic Nazism was in fact prefigured by Punk, Punk's semiotic recoding, which is something that Dick Hebdige discussed in his own work. But what I think is also interesting and worth noting here is that newer research on late 1970s UK punk, I'm thinking in particular of a book called White Riot by Duncombe and Tremblay, claims that at the best, actually, punk was only very selectively anti-racist. Now I want to make the move, the theoretical move, where I talk about my critique of memetics. So memes then, these would be considered to be memes, Pepe. And you could even, I suppose, think of Pizzagate and QAnon as memes. They travel from one place to another and so on and so forth. Memes in so this was, memes is a concept that was of course developed in the 70s, and then it had a kind of a heyday in the 90s, memetics, and then it went kind of moribund, and then it was sort of reawakened by our field, media studies. But in reawakening it, it was initially identified as a conceptual troublemaker. There are a bunch of reasons for that. Most obviously, the problem that is often referred to by scholars in our field is that it doesn't really account for agency and translation and so on. But for me, the big problem of memes, as identified by Tony Sampson, is that it actually lacks a theory of the media. It doesn't take into account the actual materiality of the media through which the message is carried. So there's no McLuhan in Dawkins' thinking at all. So I think that a better way of thinking about these things rather than memetics is more along the lines of linguistic pragmatics. And there, this is the theory that meaning is in its use and uses are local. And in particular here, I think that the post-structural theory of vernacular enunciations is very interesting and useful way to look at the way that these kinds of objects are used within these communities, in particular the way that this is developed by Deleuze and Guattari. So in that theory, that postulate on linguistics, it's not about information. Language is not about conveying information so much as it is about conforming to the rules of particular language games. And forums like this are nothing if not extremely rigidly structured through game rules. All kinds of rules exist within these kinds of communities. And that I think is very important for if you try to understand the way that they use these things and the way that they use language. The other concept that from Sampson that I find useful in rethinking this kind of stuff without using memetics is this term he uses in his most recent book, A Sleepwalker's Guide to Social Media, which he calls the dark refrain. He calls this the far right. He's very influenced by Deleuze and Guattari. He calls this the far right territorialization of the global political scene and its social media manifestations. And in particular here, he's drawing on a concept from Deleuze and a couple of concepts from them. One is the idea of a milieu, which they define as a block of space-time that is coded with periodic repetition. I find that very helpful for thinking about platforms and the relationship between platforms. And for the relationship between platforms, this I think is also very useful. They have the concept of transcoding, where one milieu serves as the model for another milieu. And milieus can actually either be different platforms or they can also be different publics within a given platform. So this is an example. I don't think I have time to go into it too much, but it is an example that we found in our research of a vernacular innovation that occurred within this language community, which is to say that a term developed over time, its meaning changed. And so this is an interesting case also because of the fact that Gamergate was brought up. This is a term that originally started in gaming. It then became an equivalent term for lulz. It then became an Islamophobic term, and then it actually moved out of the platform into several other platforms to become a territory in I think very much in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense of territory, an imaginary homeland for trolls on social media. I should mention that it was that concept was rejected by the original subculture, but that's a discussion for another time. Now I have my point of conclusion. So I would like to say that while this phenomenon seems to be bottom up, as Lance Bennett suggested, there are indeed feedbacks that go back and forth between the fringe and the mainstream. There are canny politicians who can orchestrate these kinds of dark refrains, like Trump did at the Capitol. And I think that to sort of end on a normative note, that we need to call out these kinds of dog whistles when they're used. So for example, here in the Netherlands, there's a politician by the name of Thierry Baudet who used the term boreal when he entered office, pretending that this was, I don't know what he wanted people to believe, but it was very clear that this was a dog whistle term that was essentially only used within far-right communities to refer to white Europeans. Last point, while there are bad people, I don't think that we should necessarily then demonize these subcultures across the board. And I'd like to end with this one quote, which I find very helpful for thinking about these kinds of things. And this kind of relates back to the point of methodological empathy. This is a quote from Michel Foucault. It's actually an early quote from him, but I find it very, very insightful. This is what Foucault says about this. People know what they do, and they frequently know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do is what they do does. I find that a very helpful way of thinking about the effects of these kinds of phenomenon in terms of the victims that they affect, while also at the same time being able to exercise some degree of methodological empathy and trying to understand these people and what it is that motivates them to do these things. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was fantastic. Conceptually very rich. Lots of terms and models to think about. The temporal approach, the sort of the bottom up, or the feedback between the bottom and the sort of the mainstream, the fringe and the mainstream. Methodological empathy. Lots of things to think through. This notion of milieu that you introduced us to, and then you also gave us a new term, I think, that to add to the theme of incoherence that I think came out of the first three presentations, which is meaninglessness, right? And what do people do with meaninglessness? So what we'll do now is I'd like to start a conversation among the panelists, and then open it up after a little while to the audience and have people join in the chat. And I have some questions that I'd like to put some of you in conversation with one another. But for the first one, I'm going to ask you all a question at once and ask you all to speak on it, because I hope it can tie together what you've been talking about. And it is about those what I'm thinking of is kind of some key terms from the talks, which is meaninglessness and incoherence, right? And and one sort of other theme that came out, I think, is that, or one pattern I noticed maybe, is that none of us are really thinking about the alt-right anymore as sort of the primary movement or ideology of concern, which is perhaps not surprising. I mean, our grant project had alt-right in the title, but you'll notice this conference, we've switched to reactionary digital politics, because we're thinking about how it's become more diffuse, more transnational, more maybe productively incoherent. And then one thing Alfie was saying is it could be that the alt-right is sort of a name for something that was part of a kind of broader tendency, and then the sort of liberal mainstream reaction to it distracted us from what was really going on, right? So that's my question for you, I guess, then, is what is really going on? And is the thing we need to be thinking about this meaninglessness and this incoherence, and then the way aesthetic and ideological forms take shape out of that meaninglessness and out of that incoherence? So how is that process happening online? How are these sort of aesthetic forms taking shape out of this kind of the kind of rules-based, but like sort of ludic culture of 4chan, or like the nudging culture of Facebook? How are this meaninglessness and incoherence taking shape? And is it true? So that's the kind of more kind of conceptual methodological question. And then the proposition for you is, it feels like to me that the right is much better at this, or maybe this dynamic is benefiting the right. So is that true? Do you agree with that? And why do you think that is? So that's a big question, I realize, but hopefully it can get you thinking a little bit, and maybe everyone could kind of offer their thoughts on it. And maybe we could start, if you don't mind, maybe Alfie, we could start with you, since you were, it's been the longest since we heard from you. So anything there you want to pick up?
Yeah, sure. No, I just want to say I thought all the papers were, all the talks were really useful. I mean, I think that I mean, it's kind of annoying sometimes when someone tries to draw a thread through all four papers, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I was pleased to hear all of them, that, like, there is this, I think one of the things that unites what we were saying, I sort of realized I forgot to talk about aesthetics, but that's beside the point. Everyone was talking about, in different ways, about how to deal with this kind of threat of the, let's say, far right. You also have to connect it to what's going on in the mainstream, or in this kind of I don't know what word we use for it, but this kind of what I was referring to as like liberalism, capitalism, centrism, whatever. And Leslie's talk I found it really interesting. I had no idea about that, but I found it fascinating what you were saying about how actually people get sometimes sucked towards traditional conservative values through these apparently edgy right-wing movements, because that's really important, that there's this connection between the sort of traditional centrist right and this kind of far right. And then that is actually in some ways the story of accelerationism, and because it originates, it presents itself as this kind of edginess, but also it really intersects with sort of you know, what a much wider scope of problems. And I thought that, you know, yeah, I mean, so, and I think that same again with like, you know, what Marc was saying about how, yeah, these subcultures are not the enemy in themselves, and the way they connect to the mainstream is the key. And so I thought that was a really important thread, and I do actually think that's right, that the way out from a sort of progressive perspective that we're hoping to come from, I assume, we need, if we still treat the right as a problem and the far right as a problem, but in connection with these other dominant forms of behavior and dominant forms of capitalism, and that is the way to do it, I think. And you know, and I just like to make one quick comment just about what Marc was saying about the, you know, using the Deleuze there, about the thing about territorialization, deterritorialization, and reterritorialization of the Deleuzean terms, and how it was referred to as a right territorialization. So that would be different to my take, because I think that what we saw in 2014, 15, 16 was a certain kind of deterritorialization, which presented massive opportunities for the right, but also left. And you do, of course, see the memeing Sanders, Corbyn, etc., Mélenchon in France, and so on. And I'd say that is quite interesting to think of that period as a moment of deterritorialization, and this one as a moment of reterritorialization. But I would say that it's not so much been this moment right now, it's not a reterritorialization for the right, but for capitalism, centrism, establishment politics. And what we're now up against as an enemy is a reterritorializing centrism that is an enemy that connected to it is that which we need to be aware of. So I thought that was all really provocative and interesting, and so much to take from all that. But yeah, thanks everyone. Those are my just instinctive reflections, really.
Thanks, that's great. Marc, do you want to pick up on what Alfie was saying and respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I don't know that anybody wants us to get into like this discussion about like the finer points of Deleuze and Guattari. But I do hear your point, Alfie, and it was the same kind of point that you made in your presentation, and I think it's a valid, an important point that doesn't get heard enough. I think in terms of your question, Rob, about meaninglessness and incoherence, you know, as somebody from the humanities, so I guess this is where Deleuze and Guattari does kind of creep back in. The kind of tradition of critical thinking that in some ways comes from, you know, folks like Heidegger, who also has a very dodgy right-wing elements, is can be understood as an engagement with trying to overcome meaninglessness. A lot of aspects of critical theory basically could be understood in those terms after Nietzsche. So there are different ways to deal with meaninglessness. You can deal with it through the kinds of things that we do in the humanities, in the critical theory. Through high art would be what somebody like Adorno would say, or you could do it through, you know, returning to antiquity, which is what sounds like what the folks that we've been hearing about today are interested in. They're radicals and extremists, and some of them, I'm sure, are terrorists. So these are ways of dealing with the problem of nihilism, which has been a problem for quite some time. That's one point. The other one, I think, which I find an interesting point, so I mentioned my colleague Tommaso Venturini, when looking at this stuff, says, well, what this is these are cultures of secondary orality. So this is a concept from the Toronto School of Communication, the idea that there are, McLuhan's Global Village brings back some sort of sense-making epistemological systems that are not necessarily recognizable to us in the whose minds have been formatted by the Gutenberg innovation, and this kind of mentality is not necessarily oriented towards extreme coherence. It's about constant iteration. It has to be repeated over and over again, and that's not actually a bug, that's a feature. And so the kind of incoherence is actually something that is characteristic of an oral culture. And you could then think of these kinds of cultures that I have outlined here, this is Tommaso's point, as sorts of oral cultures. And then if we think of them in those terms, then maybe we're misunderstanding them a little bit if we're trying to, the way that we approach them. We don't understand them as just really fundamentally different kinds of epistemologies.
That's really interesting. And I think that's it's an important media point to make, right? Like, I think most of us here, well, I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I think I have a Gutenberg brain, right? I'm looking for coherence all the time, trying to read that way. And I think that can lead us to misreadings. I wonder, Leslie, if you could speak to that as well, also from a rhetorical perspective. Does that notion of iteration, is that a way of thinking about this sort of attraction, the attraction to the tension? Is that something you see as a way of thinking about that? And then if so, what is that? How do we think about that in rhetorical terms? In a way, rhetoric has always been an oral art, right? that's kind of its base. So maybe rhetoric is in a good position to think about this question.
I guess it depends on what you think of Plato, but yeah. So I think that what we're talking about here in terms of iteration has more to do with desire, right? I think Alfie's discussion of desire of citizenship is very important here. In the spaces that I'm working, I used to say that the right did a better job of memeing and the like because they had more ground, right? You have a lot more ground if you don't give any hoots what you say in terms of how it affects other people. I don't think that that's the case anymore. I now view accelerationism and the things that Alex was talking about as crucial because those frameworks accept that we are at the end of history and that we have done everything we can and that fuck the rest of them is the mindset. And so that becomes crucial because that iteration and the desire to live out that tension between an acknowledgement that we've fucked everything up, yet I still have to live, is the pull of accelerationism. It's also the pull of that nihilism. It's also the pull of that Christian nationalist understanding that we are living in a late capitalist society and the end is coming, right? So all of those things go across cultures. But what's most fascinating to me is that it's not that we're not paying attention to the left or we're not paying attention to the right, is that the very concepts have so won over everyone that we're having different conversations than we could have possibly had previously.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if Alex, if you want to pick up on that, right? Because like Leslie is saying, meaning the acceleration is as a response to meaninglessness, that is kind of, reframing our sort of entire understanding of politics and culture and how we can even understand it. So what could you add to that? Is that something you see as well in the accelerationist discourse? you talk more about collapse and destruction, and sometimes it's linked to a political program. But yeah, what role does meaninglessness play in the kinds of movements you're studying?
Yeah, I agree with everything Leslie said, and I also want to take a step back and talk about incoherence and meaninglessness more broadly, and say that we have to always remember when we're talking about the role those play in the far right, what they're in reference to, what they're relative to, because it's not incoherence in general in an absolute sense. It's not meaninglessness in an absolute sense. It's incoherence and meaninglessness relative to modernity or relative to the status quo, and those two trends had, over the last 10 years, had sort of, different originating points. Like the incoherent aspect of the far right and of online communities on that side, or on the fringe, came out of video game communities that had extraordinarily hardcore, very strict identities built around things that were incoherent to the public. And that was the point. The point was to be chaotic from a public viewpoint. The point was to engage in things that had absolutely no point, no meaning to anyone who was observing from the outside. It was to share references, share allusions, share all of these things that may not even make sense to the people engaging in it, but made sense in so far as they were part of the performance of engaging in those identities. And that incoherent aspect of it sort of set the infrastructure, so to speak, for building out into, all of this sort of, memification of the far right that we saw over the past 10 years. And then the meaningless aspect came along a little bit after that, but in the same sort of framework and is out of the same sort of infrastructure. For example, like the term black pill, which at the beginning simply meant basically an acceptance of the nihilistic aspect of the world, that came out of incel culture. It came out of the same culture that produced the word red pill around, like, not that long after red pill was sort of memified. But at the beginning, like I said, it meant literally just accepting that you had no ability to change anything about the world, and that the relations between men and women would be as they were and unfairly discriminate against men. Like that's what blackpilling meant at the beginning. And the logical extension of that is that at the beginning, blackpilling basically meant that you accepted that you wanted to commit suicide. But as we know now, that didn't, like, the term blackpilling quickly became something much different than just an acceptance that suicide is the only way out. It became more of a term or a signal towards this broader rejection of modernity, a rejection of any of the sorts of meaning that are put on us from the environment and from the people that we surround ourselves with, and an embrace of something fundamentally different and fundamentally in opposition to all of the structures that are at play within society. All of that infrastructure, like the surrounding yourself and embracing yourself with the meaninglessness to the public, plus the acceptance of this new form of, like, anti-modern quote unquote nihilism, although it's not really nihilism, all of that then put together this foundation for a reactionary movement that doesn't need an ideological through line. All it needs is that, that embrace of the chaos, and then the embrace of, modernity is the enemy. If you're against modernity, you are our ally, and then a movement can be built on top of that, as I think we are seeing now.
Fantastic. That's great. I mean, that's a really well put and useful framing of meaninglessness as actually a kind of a critique of modernity and a description of modernity, a reactionary critique and description of modernity. I have lots more questions that I'd like to ask about, subcultural incoherence, methodological questions. We haven't talked about religion enough, I don't think yet. Desire and how it's different on maybe the mainstream or face culture versus fringe culture. But I think it's important that we open it up to the audience. So if the chat, I'm not sure if the chat is open to everyone yet. I think it is becoming open if it wasn't already. So if anyone has questions for the chat, or if you want anyone in the audience would like to raise their hand and pose a question, please do so. And maybe I'll ask my other question real quick while this happens, because I think while people think, because I don't see any hands quite yet, unless I'm missing them. But I wonder if this is, I think, a question. Well, it's sort of a question for all of you. But maybe we'll start with putting Marc in conversation with Alfie and also Leslie. But I wonder, Marc, you closed with this, or not closed, but you offered this sort of heuristic conceptualization and description of the internet moving through these layers, right, as a way of thinking about these layers. And I wonder, Alfie and Leslie, have you thought about the way the desire or the way affect shifts in the different layers? And then the other kind of thread of that question is to put what Alfie is saying about gamification in conversation with what Marc is saying about the sort of rules of 4chan, and the way it's a kind of rules-based space, which is sort of similar to games in some way, but maybe not quite the same thing. So I don't know if maybe Alfie, you could start with that question. And we've got a lot of other questions coming too, so then I'll stop asking.
I'll try and be really brief then, because I can see people have got their hands up and stuff. But I just wanted to say, in relation to your question there, I think that's a great point. And I thought that what Marc said about concepts of milieu, which I'm sort of familiar with through Deleuze and also through Simondon. But I think that was a really nice sort of description of it, to say that I can't 100% remember what you said, Marc, but it's something like a block of space where there's kind of repetition going on in various ways. And I think that is a really useful way of thinking about digital culture and the levels that you just referred to in your question, Rob, because what I see in these sort of my media studies work is different platforms operating ostensibly differently, but seeing the same kind of repetitions in each of them. And so, so for instance, just the example I was running with today of the dating apps, on the one hand, Trump.dating, which I hope none of you were on, is quite a different experience to Red Yenter or the socialist dating site or the Guardian Soulmates, but one sees them as part of the same milieu, and these kind of repetitious patterns happening in the way that our sort of behaviors and desires are being coded and recoded by patterns of capitalism, economics, whatever. And so I find that really useful to think about the digital realm in this kind of terms of milieu and look at the kinds of repetitions we find often across spaces. And sometimes, to bring it back to the political, what one finds things that you see on the right repeated in the center and on the left. And that's really interesting, because then you're looking at, the way digital culture structures our society, not, and it's not always a case that this on the left, this on the right, this here, and so I find that a really useful way of answering your question, Rob. I'd go with what Marc said, basically.
We do have hands, but before I go to the other questions, Leslie, did you also want to comment on that as well? Okay, maybe we should let someone else get in here, because I'm asking other questions. I'm having trouble. I have trouble keeping the chat in place. So while I figure that out, I see Alan's hand is raised. Alan, why don't you ask your question, and then I'll find one from the chat here.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks everybody for the things you said. I want to kind of, well, it's not a question to Alfie. I want to pick up on kind of what Alfie said, but sort of try and bring it back to the other questions, because I think Alfie's kind of concerned that looking at the far right is a distraction from the bigger picture. I think, well, on the one hand, I think that underestimates the scale and the kind of real and immediate harm that these groups are causing. But I think it also misunderstands the relationship between the far right and the kinds of things that you're talking about, neoliberal capitalism. It's not a distraction from them at all. It's one way of thinking about it is it's kind of a highest expression of a certain version of the political economy of neoliberal capitalism. On Friday, we have Quinn Slobodian speaking. One thing he has traced out is how a lot of the kind of the racial politics of the far right are contained within certain strands of neoliberal calculative economic approaches to politics. And they are partly playing on these things and pushing these things further. But at a more fundamental level, what I think we've seen looking at these groups is even in the accelerationists, underlying that as a politics that's fundamentally based on the ranking of bodies and of their worth, and is concerned with establishing mechanisms that will allow society to properly rank them, and with engendering the context of competition and combat that will allow us to find out who is of the most value and who is of the most worth. And their critique of contemporary society is that it fails to do that properly, because there are too many people trying to establish the equality of bodies between races and sexes and genders and so on. And I think this does speak back to this question about the aesthetics, because what we're seeing is aestheticize not just bodies, but also people practicing techniques and cultivating relationships to the world precisely that allow them to kind of demonstrate their superiority as the bearers of these bodies. So this is not a distraction from thinking about neoliberal capitalism. This is part of what it is. So I kind of want to know how people respond to that sort of way of thinking about them. I know it might seem very different from what the Acceleration and Atomwaffen are doing, but actually I think Atomwaffen is, while on the one hand in a lineage from far-right Nazism, it is also caught up in this milieu, if we're going to call it that, that ties it into this kind of processes. I'll stop there.
Alan, I think that was a perfect encapsulation to some extent that what we're looking at is the embodiment of neoliberalism and late capitalism. One of the earlier questions in the chat related to this, like how does re-enchantment figure into this? And what I've found is that even like the Churchwave people have incorporated Derrida, have incorporated D&G, have incorporated lots of high theory to try and make white supremacy and misogyny sound different, sound more intellectual in relationship to like the basilisk and some of those kinds of aspects of accelerationism that are coming out. But for the most part, it is nevertheless a coding of racial and other forms of superiority in order to maintain some aspects of the present order that they want, while heavily critiquing life in late capitalism. So yes, and.
Yeah, I'll just quickly answer and then leave it to others, because it was partly in response to what I said. So yeah, no, I mean, I actually do agree. I mean, I wasn't saying. I mean, so the first part of the question, I don't agree. I mean, I don't really want to like quantify harm, and it's like when people say, "Oh, look how many people Stalin killed, so therefore communism's bad." It doesn't really work like that. And like, you know, you could say that the far right is, of course, I'm aware that the far right has caused real harm, but so has capitalism. It's not really useful to sort of quantify the harm, but the second part of it, I absolutely agree. I think that, yeah, this is exactly my point. Was that the liberal media made a mistake, in fact a deliberate ploy to distract people from critiquing capitalism by refocusing their attention on these other things. I absolutely agree with you that these things arise as symptoms of neoliberal capitalism, and because of it, and that, yeah, the progressive position should be exactly the one you described, to critique these things and point to them as precisely as symptoms or inherently connected to the kind of neoliberal capitalism that we need to throw off. Because I absolutely agree that should be the way forward and the way to think about it. So I hope that's clear that I do agree fully with that.
I'll say one very brief thing. It's striking to me to hear accelerationism discussed in these terms that seem very homogenous, because as I encountered the concept, it was actually, I believe it was a coinage of a British culture theorist by the name of Benjamin Noyes, and it was a term that he used to describe the work specifically of Deleuze and Guattari and a few other thinkers who believed that capitalism should be accelerated to the point of its own exhaustion, which I also think is a concept that could be found in earlier Marxist thinkers as well. So obviously that's not what we're talking about today, but it does seem interesting, and that's just off the table completely, that doesn't sort of, I guess, exist anymore, that all the accelerationists have bought into this kind of racial superiority stuff. I'm not on top of that. One thing I do know a little bit about is, because I had heard Alex mention Boogaloo Boys, there was like some sort of deposition that I read by some scholar, McNabb, I believe was the name of this scholar, who researched the Boogaloo Boys on Facebook and found that on Facebook, many of the groups did not tolerate racism. And I don't know, I didn't do that research myself, but I think that also speaks to a little bit like the whole concept of connective action in the first place, where these aren't necessarily movements, they're networks, they're not always very coherent, they have lots of different sort of elements. Yeah, those were the points that I thought I might add.
I see a question from the audience, but just before we go to it, I wonder if Alex, did you want to pick up on that briefly, the relationship between right and left accelerationism, and also the kind of the Boogaloo Boys point?
Yes, absolutely. I should have known, speaking to a panel in an audience full of philosophers, that I would have had to more specifically distinguish between the various currents of accelerationism. But you're totally right, Mark. Accelerationism in the historic sense comes from that side of things, like the belief that you can essentially lean on the natural excesses of capitalism to eventually destroy it. It's not violent, like as far as we know, like that realm of accelerationism is not violent. And we also, as far as we know, it doesn't cross over much with insurrectionary accelerationism. There are some instances of following certain pathways over into the insurrectionary side, but for our purposes today, we can think of them as very distinct. And also, just a terminology thing, the sort of like philosophical, like the accelerationism that you're referring to, Mark, there's left accelerationists, right accelerationists, and then like whatever it is, like unpolitical, or I can't remember exactly, but they refer to themselves as you/accelerationists. those are distinct then from the far right violent accelerationists that I'm talking about. So there's this whole spectrum on the other side that I don't know enough about. I want to learn more about it because there are, like I said, there are a few touch points that are interesting to me. But on the topic of the Boogaloo movement, I actually I have a long-running disagreement with JJ McNabb about that particular point. So my center, we did some in-depth research right around the same time she was doing it at the sort of onset of the zenith of the Boogaloo movement in June 2020. And one of the things is that the Boogaloo movement was doing is they were actively putting out this public facade of being anti-racist and establishing these alliances across ideological grounds. Sounds kind of like what I was talking about in my talk, right? Like crossing ideological lines on purpose to unify otherwise disparate groups against the modern world, against the state. That is what the Boogaloo movement was doing and still is to a certain extent right now. What we also know is that especially before June 2020, so the first wave of the Boogaloo movement, they were heavily influenced by the neo-fascists, by the Nazis, by the harder core far right siegist accelerationists. Like I mentioned, Patriot Wave, which is sort of like they pioneered a lot of what became Boogaloo aesthetics later on. They were like the leader of that was actively involved in neo-fascist movements and talked in leaked chats about like genociding the Jews and, you know, killing Black people and like all these sorts of things. So today there has been a move over the past, let's say like 6 to 12 months, there has been a move within the Boogaloo movement to actually walk the walk a little bit more with sort of trying to, you know, create an anti-authoritarian coalition across racial and ideological lines. But the thing that I will stake my flag on is that the Boogaloo movement from the onset was linked to the like neo-fascist Turner Diaries tradition, so to speak, of accelerationism.
Thanks, Alex. That's great. There's also a really good conversation going on in oh, sorry, Alfie, were you going to say something?
No, nothing. That was unbelievably interesting.
Yeah.
I've just seen the piece that you wrote in the chat there.
Yeah, yeah, there's good conversation going in the chat. And I also see we have a hand from Paul Johnson, who is a scholar of rhetoric who's worked on conservatism as well. So Paul, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. These have all been really, really awesome talks. I kind of want to go back to Alan's point and sort of think maybe about a little of what I see as maybe subtending, Leslie, you and Alex, the point you're trying to make about the kind of mobility and flexibility of these movements to kind of recode, right, the operative understandings of what certain terms might come to sort of be meaning, right? I'm thinking like just in a Stuart Hall sense here. It's like I didn't take Alan to be saying that. I didn't think Alan was doing a ranking, right, of people. I think he was saying that for a social hierarchy to work, you need to have a ranking of people. And within like old liberal capitalism or liberal democracy, that ranking was absolutely being done. It's absolutely anchored in anti-Blackness and settlerism and gender politics. But that's being done in combination between the state, civil society, capital, the church. You know, and then like the late capitalism and the neoliberalism distinction that comes in is that it comes to be the case that the perception is that gatekeeping function is now done by capital, right? Not that those other institutions don't actually get to gatekeep, but the emergent understanding of these organizations that a lot of the talks are talking about today is that late capitalism itself is running the show, and it's impersonal, it's bureaucratized, it's the opposite of the human. Right, in other words, so they take for granted, right, this idea actually that modernity is the negation of the human in some sense, right? But they fold it into a language that repurposes it, like through a language of victimology that's more broadly accessible. So right, to Alex's point about reaching out and creating these different coalitions, they would say that they actually have a vital politics, right? They have an affirmative biopolitics of victimhood, structured around an understanding of what it means to be a person that is incomprehensible, right, to capital. But of course, right, in the old system, it was the case, right, that if the church, the state, civil society, right, thought that you were a piece of shit, they could make it so that your life was bad. But that judgment didn't necessarily come as a judgment on your soul, right? The other difference within neoliberalism is that the market takes on this function, right? This spiritual function of organizing reality. So that actually, if you don't produce value, or the market doesn't think you produce value, then you don't just suffer, right, a kind of material immiseration, right? You also are being judged as not having personhood. So it's almost a double function, right, about both perpetuating material immiseration and also perpetuating a kind of moral judgment as well. So that the market then takes on all of those personhood affirming designating functions. And so I think for like Leslie and Alex would you say that this is kind of one of the key hinges that you all are using for interpreting these phenomena, that like they are iterating a kind of theory of what it means to be a person, and that it's that theory's capacity to, right, exceed or confound, right, these other histories or theories of humanity or something that's what makes these movements so dangerous and powerful?
Paul, I think that is right, because this is all predicated on that we recognize that our lives have no value in either the previous order or in the current order. It is nevertheless an attempt, a desire to recuperate that value someplace, right? And so when Alfie talks about desire, that's really crucial, because that desire is very much a desire for an anchor, or a desire for some kind of production of life value beyond the current assessments. And what I think is really fascinating about what Alex is doing vis-a-vis accelerationists, and the thing you just said in the chat is like fascinating to me, right, is very much that this is incomprehensible to law enforcement because it is not within the demands of the state, right? It is very much about the production of the human life as valuable in some sense, based on anti-Blackness and other things as well, though. So I don't want those things to get dropped out of the conversation.
Yeah, I'll leave it there. Leslie, you said everything I could say on that one.
Yeah, that was an excellent response. I would note that we are approaching, I keep wanting to say 7 p.m., but the hour, the top of the hour, wherever you are. So with that in mind, I'd like to give all the panelists a chance to kind of add anything that you didn't get to add, any last point you wanted to make, anything that you think we need to be thinking about as we wrap up.
Maybe I'll just make one quick point on the desire thing, because that's also obviously a big point for Deleuze and Guattari, and I talked about those guys. But for them, desire is always produced. It's produced in these milieux, and the milieus that we're talking about, I think, have certain kinds of affordances that tend towards certain kinds of productions, and those are often extremely antagonistic. And that may also be something to bear in mind. They also tend to prioritize. Norcia Marez spoke of Facebook as a truthless public sphere. It's an environment. These are environments, and I'm talking now about corporate social media, not 4chan. These are environments that prioritize certain kinds of shareable content that is extremely that triggers. And so I do think that it's worth considering the design of these environments, what it is that they tend to produce, and what we can sort of do about that.
Thanks, Mark. Would anyone else like to add a last point?
No, I just to quickly say I agree with that, and that, you know, I do think this problem of desire, as Leslie was saying, as Mark was saying, is really central. I prefer myself in my own work. I try to counter Deleuze and Guattari with Lacanian psychoanalysis on the question of desire and capitalism and digital media. But I think that basically the fundamental thing is that, you know, all of these examples from the aesthetics that were fascinating, aesthetics shown through on Leslie and Alex's presentations, the question of accelerationism, all do kind of connect in this question of desire and the politics of desire, the new libidinal economy that we're living in and through in the digital realm. And this is really the battleground in which political arguments are taking place. So I think that, you know, paying attention to this question of politics and desire is is at the heart of it. And I've got so many things I want to sort of pursue on the basis of what you've all said about that. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, I've also been struggling to write down all the names and references and things I want to look up when this is over. Hopefully I can keep up with them all. Leslie and Alex, would you like to add anything?
Go for it if you got something. Okay. I want to. I'll just end by saying that I think that everything that I've been talking about is absolutely driven on a grand scale by the neoliberal world order, like Alfie has been saying, and it is a spin-off of the excesses of those things that we've been talking about through this. And on a more medium, like on a middle level, like the structures of the platforms are incredibly important to keep in mind, like Marc has been saying, because they, like the pressures, the specific unique pressures of places like 4chan, places like Telegram, the various encrypted messaging apps, the ways that they put emphasis on different structures of communities is what then ends up, giving rise to some of the very highly networked aspects of the accelerationist and, sort of like hardcore violent reactionary movements that we've been talking about. The last thing I'll say though is that a lot of this, like we've been talking a lot about incoherence and incomprehensibility and meaninglessness. A lot of this is something that is seeded on purpose by reactionary movements to make people like us and the public confused and unable to actually get a read on it. But I think a lot of the really excellent work that the people on this call and the people out, outside in this field are doing is bringing us into a better position to actually start comprehending this based on the critique of neoliberalism, based on the understanding of how platforms work, based on the lowest level tactical understanding of the aesthetics of accelerationist movements and other reactionary movements. And so just to leave it on sort of like a high note, I think we're getting to a point where we can actually understand, like, maybe this is like the reason why this has been incomprehensible is because we've been using old conventional political frameworks to try to understand it. It's still political, as Paul said, it is all political, but just in a different way, just under a different framework, using different motives, and going after different goals. And I think we will get there. We are getting there on how to understand this, and then how to respond to it comes afterwards. But it is something that is new, that is novel, that is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of the sort of conventional patterns that we have been relying on for so many years.
Yeah, so maybe we're catching up to the paradigm shift. Thanks. That's hopeful. Leslie, would you like the last word?
Yeah. Thank you to everyone for making this panel possible. It was filled with lots of ideas for all of us to pursue. As the rhetorician here, the question I want to pose to everyone is, when you're looking at these things, the question that helps me the most is, what is the audience getting from this? In what context, right? And so as we move through the different aesthetics that appear in different places, or as we move through the terms like reactionary, reaction to what, for whom, right? These are the questions that are really useful to me, because as a rhetorician, the prime question is, why did it work this way and not another way, right? And so that is a really useful aspect to me that I think is important for this conversation, but it was a really fun one. Thank you.
I agree, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists, Alfie, Bown, Leslie Hahner, Alex Newhouse, and Marc Tuters. Thank you everyone who came and joined in this conversation, especially in the chat. Thank you to Alan Finlayson, who was the PI on the project, to Cassian Osborne-Carey, to Rob Gallagher, who is appearing as the avatar of reactionary digital politics, who has been instrumental in making everything go today, and for bringing this together. I'd like to invite all of you to come back tomorrow. The topic is reactionary politics and digital platforms. I think we'll probably be picking up on some of what we said and was discussed today. So thanks everyone for a fantastic panel, and I hope to see many of you tomorrow as well.